Welcome to our first session of our Autumn 2020 series. This year, our topic is on digital transformation in traditional and new industries in Asia. I'm Richard Dasher. I direct the U.S. Asia Technology Management Center at Stanford. We present this series. We've presented it every year since 1992 on a different topic each fall. We're very happy to have a mixed audience that includes both Stanford students who are registered for credit and also guests from the local community. The way we're going to do things today and every week is we will have the formal class from now until 5:50 in the afternoon. Then we will stop recording, and after we've stopped recording, we'll have another 30 minutes or so of much more informal, interactive conversation. If our speakers can stay, great. If not, we'll talk just among ourselves. We may also split up into breakout rooms during that informal session. But for now, what I'd like to do is to get started talking about what we see is going on with digital transformation in Asia. I think that the first point to make is if you are taking this series for credit, of course you have to register for the course. It's a 1-unit pass, no credit course only. Please be sure to see the syllabus for the course requirements. Basically, this quarter, the single course requirement is to send a weekly comment by email to me that provides some evidence that you watched the session. Not just a summary of something that was on a session slide, because we will post the slides and the videos up to Canvas as soon as we can. Each comment is due within 2 weeks of that day's session, except we have a shorter time. The very last session is on November 19, and this quarter, Stanford rules are that all work should be finished by the last day of classes, which is November 20, but I'll give an extension to people until December 1 to get all of your work in. The public is very welcome. We do ask that everybody, no matter whether you're a student or whether you're coming in from the community, register for the entire series at this link below. And I explained kind of how our format is. We've got the formal class from now until 5:50, and then we have an optional networking session that will be until about 6:15 or 6:30. So today, I want to first talk about what we mean by digital transformation. The word is terribly hyped, and you see it just thrown about all over the place. I think that we need to think more carefully about what's going on when we talk about digital transformation. It's really the response to at least one, maybe two, simultaneous industrial revolutions. So we'll talk about defining it. We'll also have a couple of slides on the impact of COVID-19. Then we will talk about the progress of digital transformation in Asia with the US as a reference point. And then finally, at the end, I will give you some information about our upcoming sessions in this series. We're very excited about the subsequent things that will be happening. So we're in the middle of two industrial revolutions right now. This is generally called the third and the fourth industrial revolution. There are several books and articles that use this kind of numbering and terminology. If you go back, you see that the first industrial revolution was when people started to use machines to accomplish tasks that typically had done by hand before then, mechanization. The second industrial revolution was when people found new ways of using those machines in order to incredibly transform business. The second industrial revolution was really the era of mass manufacturing. So the new ways of using machines put them together into assembly lines, standardized parts. The social implications of this had to do with a total change in the structure of the labor force. so that suddenly there are people totally dependent on salaries. That's a major segment of the population. Mass urbanization happened in the 19th century. We started to have something similar to the first industrial revolution happening really after World War II, and that's the advent of digital technologies. You can divide this into three kind of stages based on architecture. There was the old mainframe terminal stage, there was the old client server stage. Now, really, since about 2005, we've really been in the era of cloud computing. This is all about digital technology becoming ubiquitous. The fourth revolution is the advent of new tools in order to find new ways of getting value from all of this digital data. So Industry 4.0 is really a transition. This specifically refers to the integration of operation technology and information technology. So for example, you predict how many parts you're going to need, and you use that to control the factory so that the factory makes exactly the right amount. So Industry 4.0 is a new way of using digital data. But really, the things that are going to drive this major new approaches, one is analytics. The more new kind of analytics you have, the more value you can get from your data, and also automation. So these are the new tools that are really hot: artificial intelligence, blockchain, edge computing, quantum computing. There are, several other things too. This is not intended to be comprehensive, but that's a revolution. It's a revolution because people's basic lives are changing. Just in my working life, I have seen huge changes in the way that you get anything done. I can't imagine what it used to be like before I had a smartphone. And you go back to the 1950s, and really digital technology was something that only concerned 0.1% of the entire population. Now it's really becoming ubiquitous. So for example, the third industrial revolution, a great kind of metric is how many people are using cloud computing. So 96% of the respondents to this survey in 2018 said that their companies are using the cloud. Only 2 years before that, only 72% of respondents to the same survey said that. Of the people using cloud, 71% of them are using both public cloud and private cloud. Public cloud like AWS or something that's hosted somewhere like Google, and private cloud, maybe your on-premise, your own on-premise data center. So you're seeing that cloud computing is far along. Now, this survey was probably done in the US. The source did not specify where the people were, because my sense is that Northeast Asia has been quite behind the US in shifting to cloud computing. We get to that in just a few minutes. So with regard to the use of new tools, here's an example about the things that people are using artificial intelligence for, and the percentage of companies that are using artificial intelligence for these different functions. So here are the industries: automotive and automotive assembly, telecom, travel, transport, financial services, consumer packaged goods, retail. You get the picture. Robot process automation is where you completely automate some sort of a process that used to involve human dialogue. Think what happens when you call customer service. Machine learning is just general. Artificial intelligence is just general. I don't know. I think that was kind of some sort of infrastructure use, not really for a specific customer-facing purpose. Natural language understanding, virtual agents, physical robotics, natural language speech understanding, and natural language generation, finally autonomous vehicles. The point is, over here on the right, you see that in the automotive industry, 76% of companies are using AI at least for one function or one process in their company. Now, the leaders in this kind of survey are using at least 5 different AI programs. But in any case, the point here is that the percentage has also changed. Double-digit increase in the use of artificial intelligence really just within the last couple of years. So this is just to give you an indication of how fast things are moving and how much things are changing. What happens with the companies is that they will start to adopt digital technologies for these major 3 functions. You're either transferring data, you're storing data, or you're processing data. And now you're applying new tools to these functions. And what you can say at the end of this is that you have undergone digitalization. But I would like to reserve the term transformation for what happens after that. Digital transformation is different from just digital adoption. So if cloud computing is really the adoption of digital technology, cloud first IT architecture, where you go to the cloud before you have something on your machine, on your desktop or wherever, is really post transformation. Use of big data analytics may be adoption. It's when you use them to change your core business, to develop new customer experiences. Or for example, are you going to use some data analytic to do your employee evaluation? That kind of thing is data driven. Online advertising is really an adoption. What kind of transformations have happened inside advertising and marketing? Real-time bidding. The price of an advertisement space on an internet website probably changes every 100 milliseconds. There are marketplaces that aggregate the demand side and the supply side, who's got ad space, who wants to buy ads, and this is all done automatically now. This is a new way. You're not buying ads space for a specific price, really. Influencer marketing is another kind of transformed business that happens because people have gone to online advertising where they can measure the influence of particular users. Information technology in cars and factories, I put 2 things together because, okay, IT's been going into cars, IT's been going into factories for years. It's really when you see autonomous vehicles and ride sharing that you're talking about digital transformation of business. Intelligent robots and smart factories have a totally different way of doing very old functions. Predictive maintenance scheduling are really a different way of doing a core function that you used to have to do by hand. So I would say that these are where the transformations are. E-commerce, selling things online, that's a great digitalization function. What you do with it to change your business is things like crowdsourcing or price optimization. Go to an airline's website on 3 different days and notice how the same ticket will have a different price every time. Tends to get more expensive because they know you've come back and they want you to go on and buy it. Value-driven pricing is where you calculate the total value that your service is going to provide to the client, and you aim for a percentage of that value, as opposed to just plain and simple figuring out the cost of your goods and then adding some sort of a profit margin on top of it. So, these are post-transformation things. Using chatbots for communications like Siri was really an adoption function. Alexa, when she's starting to control things like my door and my air conditioner and my car, now we're talking about something that's transformed. Robot process automation, where you really change what you're doing with a business, is real transformation. Online payment, financial services is different when the bank is completely data driven in what kind of products they offer you and what kind of terms they will offer you for a loan. So, I think that one difference between adoption and transformation is that adoption can be purely additive. You add digital technology to the things you are already doing. But a transformation involves changing your core, giving up some old way of doing things in order to shift your operations to a new way. Now, adoption is not, I'm not, belittling adoption at all. You can create a amazing amount of value just by digital adoption. Look at Google. So Google's revenues came from online advertising. Google didn't have to change anything. It was a new company. It was a new startup. But if you look closer, Google's online advertising really got so big because it was taking revenue away from traditional advertising channels, right? Newspapers and traditional TV advertising have really taken a hit thanks to Google and Facebook and a few other of the online advertisers. So this shift to online advertising was really a classic case of what Professor Clayton Christensen, the late Professor Christensen at Harvard, called disruptive innovation. So if you look at it from the standpoint of the newspapers and the TV channels, they got disrupted. Google was a new entrant. It did not have to give up anything. So on the one hand, it looks additive for Google. Google looks like an addition to the world. But when you look at the entire advertising industry, there was transformation going on. Now, it's easy to adopt something new. It's really hard to change the way that you used to be doing things. First of all, the people up at the top have to see the change before it happens. The earlier you can identify an impending change, the less you are likely to be disrupted by it, the more you will be able to respond to it. And you have to develop throughout the company capabilities and also incentives to get people to give up what they used to do and adopt something new. And of course, the alternative is to be disrupted by somebody from the outside, like Google coming in. And that's really what happened to a lot of these old advertisers. So digital transformation creates an incredible amount of value. This is World Economic Forum estimate that in 10 years, from 2016 to 2025, digital transformation, however they define it, I'm not guaranteeing that they're using as careful a definition as I just did, will contribute $100 trillion to the world economy. So the US annual size of the American economy is 60 or 70 trillion, depending on how you calculate it. So that's greater than the size of the US economy that's going to be given over this 10-year period. Now, over 12 trillion are going to go to the industries. What they're seeing is that the industries are going to have increased efficiency, they're going to have new sales. So 12 trillion to automotive, consumer industries, electricity, and logistics. But except for consumer industries, by far, the greatest value is going to society outside of the business spreadsheets of any particular company. So, for example, with automotive, the value includes reduced crash costs, lower insurance premiums, fewer injuries, which is hard to calculate, and lower carbon emissions. But they estimate that while the automobile industry is going to get $0.7 trillion out of digital transformation, and that will account for about 8% of their revenues, people will benefit to the tune of about 3.14 trillion. So this is why people are excited about digital transformation. There's a lot of money involved. Um, the Actually, COVID-19 basically has accelerated what was already going on. The digital transformation was enabling new patterns of work or business. And what COVID-19 did was it shifted things away from just something that looks like a nice new possibility to a must-have capability. If it weren't for internet-based video conferencing, we probably would not be having this class right now at all. So, work from home is what we've all had to do for the last few months, or a lot of us have had to do for the last few months, and it wouldn't have been possible without Zoom and WebEx and a few other good programs. Shopping from home moved into the mainstream. Now, early adopters, young people were already doing it a lot, but my 80-year-old sister hasn't set foot in a grocery store for the last 4 months. So, she's moved into shopping from home. And I think that mainstream is much more common than it used to be. I also think that this cloud first IT architecture, what you have to have, the architecture you have to have in order to make something like Slack work, in order to do Microsoft Teams, in order to do online signing of documents, that kind of thing is, enabled by digital transformation. So thanks to digital transformation having proceeded as far as it has, we've gotten through the mess this year a lot better than we would have otherwise. However, one feature of industrial revolutions is an increase in inequality. So the winning industries are doing great. Have you taken a look at Zoom's stock price recently? The losing industries are really having trouble. Traditional retail, how many, bankruptcies have we already seen? Today, I think Carnival Cruise Lines just announced they were not going to have any cruises for the next year, and they're going to have to sell 18 cruise ships, probably at a loss. So that digital divide also correlates with a gap in wealth in the population. Unfortunately, the digital haves are in much better position to get through the challenge of COVID-19 and everything else this year, while the people who are at risk are in much greater challenge. This whole situation has really divided the jobs that are relatively secure, especially the ones you can do from home, versus the precarious jobs that may not survive because the company may not survive. Another point that COVID-19 did is it did change people's thinking so that not only were they worried about making money, they were worried about resilience. So when you have a major setback like this, you want to have resilience. And sure enough, global supply chain strategies were already threatened by US-China tension. This is not something that just started this January, but the COVID-19 certainly brought it up into even more sharp relief. The awareness of human risks, meaning your people may get sick, encourages companies to go ahead with automation. So COVID-19, on the one hand, has encouraged digital transformation. There's this kind of symbiotic relationship between the two. I think the important thing to remember, though, is that even though we've undergone huge economic loss as a result of, this whole pandemic this year, that's not the end of the Industrial Revolution. On a macro level, the losses are being mitigated by digital transformation. And I think that when you look at questionable sectors, it's been fascinating to me to see which of the retailers are doing well. Walmart, Target, versus which of the retailers are not. The ones that were kind of basing a lot of their value on in-store experience and maybe on the color of the shopping bag that you get when you buy something. So the digital infrastructure has really helped people in some industries to survive. Um, in this kind of context, innovation is probably even more important than usual. New challenges usually do equal new opportunities. That's a very Silicon Valley way of looking at the world. Many great companies started in previous downturns. And coming up, the one thing to note, though, is while the economy is so bad, it is hard to get people to spend a lot of money all at once. So whatever your new way, your post-transformation way of doing things will be, you're probably not going to be able to spend a lot of money before you start to make money at it. Keep the capital cost low and have early revenue is absolutely essential. So that's kind of where we are in regard to what's going on. What I want to do now is to start to look at what's going on in Asia with this kind of digital transformation. So interestingly enough, Asia is projected to increase revenues more than anywhere else in the world thanks to digital transformation. So here's Asia Pacific and North America. The bottom graph was the contributions to revenue from digital transformation in 2015, and the top graph is 2018. So Asia was already getting more out of digital transformation than North America or Europe. And that is was predicted back then. This was work back in 2016 to continue until 2018. And, you know, this just keeps going on. I think that the big picture, the 30,000 foot view, so over the last 20 years is when we have developed our IT giants that in some ways are almost like the engine of the digital revolution. Facebook, Apple, Google, Amazon, or maybe it's Facebook, Amazon, Google, and Apple. Anyway, in Asia, most countries have developed their own national champions for the digital economy, new IT firms that have done very well. And especially these days, we're seeing the ecosystem surrounding these IT giants diverging more and more from the US. This is a fact. You can argue whether this is a good thing or necessary for national security, but it's a fact that the ecosystems are separating from each other. There are new conglomerations of services by these IT giants. They're getting into all kinds of businesses. In some ways, they've had an easier time getting into new business lines than FAGA has in the US because of antitrust problems. All across Asia, really, digital transformation is driven by people. And IT use by the people in Asia, more so than in the United States or elsewhere, is mobile first. Most people in Asia are accessing the internet by smartphones now. There's a huge variation. Smartphone penetration is still less than 50% in India, but it's more like 96% in countries in Southeast Asia. So all across Asia, you're also seeing national efforts to develop next generation technologies, especially artificial intelligence, blockchain, quantum computing. It's interesting that I'm seeing efforts in robotics too, but I think that robotics is an area where the US seems to be actually more active. There is a very wide variation between different countries. There's also a wide variation between different industries. This is the gap between leaders and laggards. We'll come back to that. Arguably, digital translation started later, and so it's still at an earlier stage in Asia than it is in the US. So let's look country by country. In China, digital transformation really took off beginning around 2001, 2002. This was the same time that Google was growing steadily with its Web 2.0 kind of business model. Um, for the first time since the Communist Revolution in 1949, private companies were really leading the way forward in China. But state policy has been a very important driver of private companies as well as public companies. And the IT giants in China, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, and Xiaomi, are really the first multinational corporations, private corporations that China has seen. There are a few others that are pushing it, Huawei, Haier, and a few others, but certainly BATX are extremely global in their reach. Um, Digital transformation is driven by consumer-facing industries and also the state policies that promoted general innovation. You know, one of the main areas of innovation was digital technology. And just recently, a month or two ago, the Chinese government announced its Digital Transformation Partnership Action Plan, which is going to give special help to small and medium-sized companies so that they don't have the widening gap between have and have-nots. Um, Not a bad idea. The recent friction between China and the US is certainly going to accelerate the growth of domestic IT industries in China, both on the hardware side and the software side. And I would say that what's worth watching now, retail in China. So you've had huge e-commerce. What's going to happen to the traditional retailers in China? Will they die or will they transform? I would watch banking services. This is a very active area. I've got a couple of slides on, and also automotive. 3 autonomous vehicle companies spun out of Baidu, and there are major new efforts related to mobile energy and mobile transport. So I think that what you see is China's BATX looks an awful lot like GAFA in the US. Here are Baidu and Xiaomi and Tencent and Alibaba, and look at all the sectors they're in: health, retail, mobility, media and entertainment, financials, travel and food. In fact, it's not infrequent that I see people predict that BATX is going to conquer everything. A specific quote from March this year came from this online blog in a site called Information is Everywhere. This is just copied off of their page where, you know, in Europe, these changes were brought out by GAFA, in China by BATX. Alibaba, through various strategic investments in local players such as Paytm in India and Lazada in Southeast Asia, is waging a merciless war against its main competitor, Amazon. So, boom, global business. The dinosaurs are all, you know, fighting against each other. This Actually, they're not dinosaurs. That was a nice image, but the wrong one. I have a couple of pages on challenger banks in Asia, and I want you to look and see how much the IT firms were involved in them. So all 4 BATX each are behind a different challenger bank in China. These have done really well. Hong Kong has this thing called NEAT, which is not really a bank, but that's because they haven't authorized any digital banks until last year, and they're still testing the whether something can be a digital bank. But guess what this company is doing? It's providing multi-currency business accounts and also personal accounts. Japan, the digital banks, digital first banks or digital only banks really started 20 years ago. And behind them were mostly big financial corporations. Sumitomo Mitsui Banking Corporation, one of Japan's biggest banks. Mitsubishi UFJ Bank. And also, you know, you had the telecoms involved. The two big competitors to each other were behind too. Rakuten got into the act. Rakuten is a very large e-commerce company in Japan. And there is a new startup that's still happening there. In South Korea, um, Kakao Bank came from the equivalent of Rakuten, right? Actually, Kakao was really started more as a messaging service, but they've become an IT giant. And K-Bank was really founded by a consortium of 20 companies led by Korea Telecom. Um, if you go on down into Vietnam, there's a digital only bank in Vietnam. There are 5 in India, none of which are connected to existing IT firms. So what I think you're seeing is that China had about a generation ahead of Southeast Asia and also South Asia. The companies are a lot newer. The old gateways to China have really just gotten into the virtual banking space. Hong Kong issued licenses beginning last March. Singapore has announced last year that it would begin accepting applications and grant up to 5 entities. Taiwan issued those first licenses in 2020. So this is a good example that kind of gives you how things are laid out. So I've talked about China, and through all these virtual banks, you see me getting to the other areas of Asia. Northeast Asia has incredibly high potential for digital transformation, but they're being held back by a lot of legacy systems. So over here on the right, the Economist Intelligence Unit came up with an Asian Digital Transformation Index that ranked countries on 3 things: the quality of their digital infrastructure and pervasiveness of it, their human capital, could people actually work with these new tools, and also industry connectivity. Singapore came in at number 1, but South Korea and Japan were number 2 and 3. South Korea scored highest in the human capital category. This surprises a lot of people because most people are familiar with the more conservative sides of South Korea and Japan. Just this spring, the Korea Industrial Technology Association surveyed about 1,500 companies and found that only 9.7% of them were actively pursuing digital transformation. 20.9% were partially pursuing it. 21.8% say they would think about it, do it sometime in the future, and 36.8% said we're not going to do it. So that's kind of remarkably conservative. Out of these 2 groups, about 30% of the population, only 20% of all of the surveys. So I would assume that this is, you know, maybe 2/3 out of this group, have people who are dedicated, people or offices that are dedicated to achieving digital transformation. Japan, in a classic kind of thing about Japan, the government METI, Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, warned about 18 months ago, quote, that the corporate sector is poised to fall off a digital cliff in the year 2025. They said it's being held back by legacy systems. And one data point related to that, when Microsoft stopped supporting Windows 7 in January of this year, there were still 14 million computers running Windows 7 in Japan. So the thing about the digital cliff was reported in Financial Times this January, partly because in addition to slow legacy systems, they're not as secure as they should be. Chinese hackers had just gotten into Mitsubishi Electric core systems in January, and that made big news. So why are there such problems with changing the core in Japan? It's the power of the legacy industries. The adoption of cloud first architecture and conversion of legacy data are very expensive. They require entire companies to move. And, the legacy industries had a really good generation last generation. They were top in the world when it came to quality standards. You may not know that ISO standards for quality, ISO 9000, used to require companies to keep written copies of all of the industry standards that they followed, which meant that you could access them all online, but you also had to print them out and put them in a big filing cabinet. So that was one problem. You also had some things that were just old style stuff. Japan has been criticized severely for still wanting to have the stamp on a document. Um, Although arguably that would be really easy to turn into some sort of a digital stamp. Um, I think that both countries do have active new players in consumer facing digital industries. So not only Rakuten, which is 20 years old, but Mercari in Japan is doing really well. Kakao in Korea is doing really well. What I would watch in Northeast Asia is very advanced technology development. I would also watch for the advent of smart factories and other company-wide IoT systems, and I would watch open innovation because the Japanese and Korean companies are very interested in partnering in some way with startup companies, a lot of them in Silicon Valley. So if they do that well, then they may be able to smooth out this transition from old to new a lot better. Um, in Southeast Asia, you also have consumer-driven digital industries. This is a new middle class. The population in Southeast Asia is relatively young. 96% of the population accesses the internet primarily by a smartphone. Now, this is an interesting graph over to the side. This is the contribution of the internet economy, whatever that is, uh, internet economy, digital economy, online, everything, to as a percentage of the GDP of the country, the gross domestic product of the country. So in 2016, the US got 6.5% of its gross domestic product from the internet economy. The equivalent in Southeast Asia was somewhere between 1.3% and 3.7%. So let's say 4 times as much. Now, if it grows by another 4 times or 5 times in Southeast Asia between 2015 and 25, the US growth cannot be that fast because Southeast Asia was starting from closer to zero. So the size of the internet economy in Southeast Asia is going to become very, very interesting as people go along. One sidebar is the national champions. So you had ride hailing services that looked an awful lot like Uber when they were started. Gojek started in Indonesia in 2010. Grab started in Singapore in 2012. Grab went international really quick, all over Southeast Asia. Gojek grew the big Indonesia market more than it went international, although they're both international now. They both provide all sorts of services from food delivery to banking to probably peer-to-peer loans, I'm not sure. Anyway, the competition between Gojek and Grab really looks a lot like the competition between Alibaba and Tencent in China. And you've got a similar situation with newly internationalized big IT giants that are becoming IT conglomerates. Lazada and Tokopedia in Southeast Asia were e-commerce companies. So in Southeast Asia, you're seeing a huge jump in the number of people who do their shopping online first. So this was a survey done by Facebook and Bain in May of 2020 that Southeast Asia wide, in 2019, the percentage of respondents of this big survey who really they did online shopping first was 30%, and by 2020, May of 2020, it was 44%. And you can see country by country, right? This is Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Singapore, Thailand, and Philippines. But we don't know how much of that is due to COVID-19, but the point of it is that people are getting more and more new style in their lifestyles in Asia. This translates into real money. So Southeast Asia wide, kind of from the same survey, the online retail gross market value, GMV, in US dollars in 2020 is estimated to be $53 billion, but by 2025, within 5 years, they expect it to grow 3 times to be $147 billion. This was the 120 billion was their last forecast that they had done 1 year ago. So they revised it that much up just in 1 year. Yeah, we're talking about a lot of money. If you jump ahead to India, India has had a very different pattern of economic development than than China. It's the world's second largest country in terms of population. But I think that what happened in China was much more government control. You don't see the interior in China. You've seen all of the result of the mass urban movement to the East Coast cities and other things you don't see so well. But India has had, since 2017, a big government initiative called Digital India. Probably the trademark that was an absolutely incredible thing was this Aadhaar, biometric national ID program, where they were able to get 1.2 billion people to have a digital ID that the government could keep. You're also seeing India as number 2 behind China in things like the number of app downloads, the number of wireless phone subscribers. Notice that's not smartphone, right? The number of internet subscribers, the number of smartphone devices, and also the number of users engaged in social media. So India has a population that is kind of exploding with digital technology, but Indian industry is much more, there's a wide gap between the ones that are moving ahead and the ones that are lagging behind. So the Economist Intelligence Unit came up with a India Digital Transformation Index that they checked out across industries in India. They did a survey of 220 firms, each of which were quite large, about $200 million in sales or more. And they gave them a score on this index for digital transformation, whatever, friendly. And the high score in ICT industries was 71, which is not surprised that it's high. The low score was 33. The median was 50. 41% of the people in that survey, though, scored in the top 25%. 26% of the ICT companies, though, scored in the bottom 25%. So that same kind of thing. In financial services, you see 28% leaders, 17% laggards. Real estate and construction is actually a very forward-looking industry, where 40% of the companies scored in the leader category. And With regard to professional services, you had 36% in the leader category, education and health 24%, manufacturing 21%, and transport being pretty low. Most manufacturing companies were right in the middle, right? Anyway, this kind of situation really shows an almost island type pattern of development where you have certain clusters of highly advanced companies, highly active digital strategies, and a lot of new things going on. We looked at 5 different, digital only challenger banks in India, but there's also an awful lot of businesses that are still doing the old way. Will they be helped along like the Chinese are helping along their SMEs with this new partnership plan? Or will the gap grow is a matter that is yet to be resolved. So this, yeah, I'm going the wrong direction. Oops, there we go. So I'm really down to the summary for today's presentation. I think that when we talk about digital transformation, you really want to talk not only about adopting new technologies, but you talk about the change that you make in some core aspect of your business. Either the way that you interact with your customers, or the way that you evaluate your employees, or the way that you determine your company's strategy in the future. Um, that kind of core transformation is what we really want to examine in subsequent sessions of our course this time. The digital transformation is really how companies are getting along in the middle of 2 industrial revolutions. This was accelerated further by COVID-19, where really the sense for digital transformation is no longer, this is great, this is exciting, this is something wonderful for somebody. It's, we've got to have it or we die. And that is, a major change, and one reason why we think this is a good topic for our series this fall. Across Asia, we've seen all of the markets really driven by consumers. New patterns, new wealth created among consumers that feeds back into itself and leads to even new kind of patterns of growth. I think we may see the fastest growth in digitalization, adoption of digital technologies in the entire world for the next 10 years. With regard to digital transformation, a lot depends on what happens to the losers. I think that across Japan, I'm seeing major corporations really worried about their IT infrastructure and really making big investments in it. I'm seeing a lot of investment in digital transformation ideas by venture capitalists all across Asia. So I want to just verbally say what we're going to talk about in some subsequent sessions. I'm very excited that next week, September 24th, our speaker will be Dr. Daniel Zhang, who is the chairman of Wumart, one of China's largest retail supermarkets, and something like 600 or 700 stores in their chain. He's going to talk about their digital transformation and how the retail industry in China is changing. 2 weeks from today, on October 1st, we've got a panel that I think you'll find very interesting because it hits social entrepreneurship as well as digital transformation. We have a panel of 3 people who will talk about the role of nonprofits in bringing technologies into healthcare access in India. One of our speakers is Ms. Rekha Pai. She is a board member of IntelliHealth. She's also a impact investor, angel investor. Another person on the panel is Dr. Priyanjali Datta. And Dr. Datta is the founder and CEO of Arugya, which started out by doing women's health screening and is now leading a consortium to do COVID-19 screening in India. And also their mentor, most recently Dr. Datta's mentor, Ravi Rao from Cisco Systems India. So he's going to talk about what Cisco sees in this. On October the 8th, we're looking to have a new type of venture capital firm come in. So Rocketship.ai is a data-driven venture capital firm that uses big data analytics to identify and evaluate, attach valuations to potential startup investments worldwide. So they've really globalized, democratized the venture capital investing industry. They're a Silicon Valley company, but the person we have coming to speak is Ms. Madhu Iyer, who was also the chief data officer for Gojek. So it will be interesting to see globalization in VC. On the 15th, we're going to have Dr. James Peng, who is the founder and CEO of one of China's autonomous vehicle companies, Pony.ai. So Dr. Peng has spoken for us a few years ago. It will be great to have him come back. And on the 22nd, we have a panel of two speakers about education businesses and how they're undergoing digital transformation. Ms. Vu Van, this founder and CEO of ELSA, which is really focused on the Vietnam market, is going to talk about their pronunciation coach, which is automated, and also YJ Kim, I think, is going to talk to us about RID, R-I-I-D, which is a very successful South Korean education technology company. And moving on, we have crowdsourcing represented on October the 29th. Ms. Lu Li, who is developing Asia markets for Indiegogo, is going to come and talk about what's going on there. We're still putting together a couple of the programs in November. I don't have speakers confirmed, so I don't want to mention anything. But our very last session in the series on November 19 is going to be Mr. Tom Siebel. So Tom Siebel is the founder of Siebel Systems, which was later bought, and now the founder of C3.ai, which is one of the main AI development platforms, competing against Azure and competing against AWS and so forth. He just wrote a book on digital transformation. So this is perfect for our series at this point. We're very excited that he is going to come and be with us that day. So I think it's going to be quite an interesting series. Let me turn this around now and ask what kind of questions are coming up. Kimberly, I think, have you been getting questions on chat or not? We can ask people to send in their questions now.
Perfect. So no questions quite yet, other than there's definitely interest in seeing the slides. So yes, feel free to.
So where will the slides be posted? For students, we'll post them on Canvas, but we'll post them on our website very soon, right?
Correct, yes.
And we'll also have this video up. It will go on Canvas first and then be posted on the internet really within a few days, within a week or so, I hope. Mm-hmm. So we have a very interesting group who are assembled. It's nice to see people that I recognize as being some of our visiting scholars from companies in Asia. I also see some of our representatives who are still in Asia. That's one thing that we can do now that we couldn't do before. Also, some of our really good friends from Silicon Valley who we've known for years. I recognize a couple of diplomats from overseas who are assigned to countries like Japan. I'm seeing, yeah, a very interesting group from major companies, from startup companies, as well as our students. Um, I'm curious if anyone has war stories to tell about digital transformation. Not really. Okay. No questions, huh?
No questions as yet. We can also conclude the recording if you'd like.
I think let's do that.
Okay.
We'll cut the recording, and anybody who wants to stay and interact more informally can do that, even though we're quite a bit shorter than the actual class time. Maybe that's a good thing.
Oh wait, we do.
Okay,
Sorry,
everybody,
we
thanks.
do.
We'll end the session. The
We
phone.
actually do have one question.
Okay.
The question is, will the influence of COVID-19 continue? So probably the trajectory and how that will impact going forward.
That's a really interesting question. I do think that we may have gone a little bit further than the needle will stay at because we can't get together. So what I'm expecting to see is all the people who've had trouble transitioning from in-person formats to online formats now are going to have to transition from online only to hybrid, because there are some really good things about this kind of a format. There are some things that are not so good. You can't have the accidental conversations in this format that you can with when you're standing around drinking coffee with each other. Um, and there's a sense of, pregnant silences, right? Uh, most times when you're standing around doing networking, people are not talking all the time. But I think that one of the things that will happen is we'll find hybrid kind of arrangements that are more resilient. They can be offered online, as well as the kind of in-person benefits that people will want to have. With regard to digital technologies, there's no way back. We've crossed that Rubicon a long time ago. And we will see continued development of more new tools. It is absolutely critical to consider problems like ethics. It is absolutely critical to consider problems like national security. But that's going to happen in the context of everything moving forward with new ways of communicating. New ways of understanding, new ways of engaging. Um, so, yeah, the impact of COVID was as an accelerant, and I think, yeah, we're not going to go back to the way it was before COVID, but we will move forward to a kind of maybe more interesting context where there are all sorts of ways for people to interact.
We've had several more questions come in.
Okay.
I think everyone was just shy at the beginning. So the next question is, what happens if China closes its internet due to security issues and further disengages from the West? Is that going to be an issue? And then continues with, for example, Zoom treats traffic in China differently than outside China.
Well, you know, uh, the firewall is quite complicated when you really look at it. And I think that you are seeing the whole ecosystem inside China becoming further apart, right? The term that's used a lot is decoupling. I personally don't want to see complete decoupling because I think that's not in our national security interests. I think that what we really need is a approach toward security protocols that's international, and also we need a kind of it needs there needs to be mutual market access. Speaking frankly, everybody loses if the internet fragments and if China does have its own completely different way of doing things from the US. It reduces the choices that people will have. And when you reduce choices, that's not good for people. For the companies involved, even though they're gigantic companies, a lot of them, unless you can really have global access to revenue, you probably cannot support the level of innovation that's required to stay healthy. So I do think that over the short term, we're going to see a continued distancing between the US and China. I think we're seeing both parties, both the Democrats and the Republicans, are kind of in that national defense first mode right now. And I think that hopefully what will happen will not be a complete new equivalent of an Iron Curtain, because I don't think that's good for anybody. Um, yeah, that's a very good question. It's a really hard question for the people who are involved in national security to answer.
Next
Okay.
question is, how do you suggest we explain digital transformation to Japanese companies so it is not a buzzword versus actionable item?
That's a great question because there is a tendency in Japan to get a great new word and throw that label around rather indiscriminately and kind of forget what's really going on. And I do think that um, one of the big challenges for innovation in general in Japan is to realize that it often involves giving up something as well as adopting something new. And so that is a lesson that will be learned one way or another. The sooner that people can be quick to grasp that that's really what's going on, the core functions of companies are changing, um, the better they will do. Because the lesson is going to happen. It's just going to be really painful if people don't really think carefully about what they're trying to do. Um, yeah, you see a lot of digital transformation that is really about adopting digital technology, but it's really about optimizing their use so that they really bring you as much value as you can get from them. Thanks. Next.
The next question is, do you think governments in Asia should actively regulate digital transformation to build guards against huge possible value transfer to international firms? Will that see FAGA's influence going down?
That's a great question. Um, it will be interesting to see what happens in the successor to the TPP. I forget, it's called CPTPP or something like that, Cooperative Partnership for the Trans-Pacific, whatever. And it does have a lot of content about data policies. And I have to say that the original TPP really kind of showed the influence of the big American IT firms. You could see a paragraph and say, oh, I'm pretty sure Facebook wrote that one, and another paragraph and say, I know Disney wrote that one. So I do think that the role of government is to provide the best possible environment for its people to go forward and its economy to go forward. That typically falls into one of two ways. It's either trying to keep a level playing field now, which is kind of the current worry about FAGA, right? or it's an investment in the future to make sure that your country has the kind of human resources and technology resources that it's going to need to be competitive 10 years from now. Um, to the extent that governments do this in some sort of a rules-based fashion and preferably coordinate with each other, I think it could be well done. But one of the dangers of the private sector national champions is that they're winners. They're people are very proud of them, and so sometimes countries do too much for them, right? The government may start to think they can pick the next winner, and that usually doesn't work either. So the role of government is going to be very delicate. I personally think that you're going to see a more enforced open infrastructure. The developers, software developers, are already forcing this to happen. Nobody wants to get locked into one vendor's ecosystem. So even though you've got AWS as a platform and Google Cloud as a platform, the people who are developing particular APIs on top of that, whether it's things like Stripe or whatever, and Stripe I think works in the Salesforce ecosystem, or the new kind of artificial intelligence development companies like Databrick or Data Robot. Um, there's a lot of pressure for those to offer customers, the users, portability for their applications and portability for their systems. So in some ways, I think that there is a natural limit to the power of FAGA. Um, but it would not surprise me to see a certain amount of splitting them up or forcing them to find new ways of doing things. Google is now really part of Alphabet, and Alphabet is a holding company. And one reason is because American antitrust law would be sort of severe on Google if they get too dominant in any one particular business. So, um, as long as governments don't pick winners, as long as they really are looking at what their people need now and what they will need 10 years from now, they can play a productive role in enforcing things like safety and privacy and ethics.
Thank you. Next question is, how does digital transformation in the US and China and Southeast Asia going to impact Europe? What is Europe doing in digital transformation?
Europe is an interesting kind of approach where they tend to look at growth in a slightly less breakneck fashion. American growth really translated well into Asia Pacific because you've got all these venture funded companies that are trying to grow by 100% a year. The growth patterns in Europe tend to be more like 40 or 50% a year for somebody doing really well, but arguably it's more long term focused. I think that the other thing that Europe has had some real challenges on recently, but actually is far along ahead of where we are, is the negotiation of standards. So, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regimen, or whatever that is, which is all about data privacy and is something that the rest of the world is looking to as a standard now. So I think the Europeans have a high quality. They will continue to work well. I'm also seeing a movement that's making Europe look more interesting as America starts to look more isolationist. The immigration issues that the US is dealing with are really encouraging people not to look at developing in America, but look at developing in Eastern Europe. So um, it will be an interesting world. I think Europe will do just fine, but I think that I'm hoping we don't lose the global framework that we've built for the last 70 years.
Indeed. Next question is it seems that we are mostly focusing on consumer facing stuff, but can you comment on what you think of enterprise facing software market trends transformation? Asia seems to be slower than the US in adopting things like Workday, et cetera.
Yeah, a lot of that has to do with they're not exactly consumer facing, but they're pretty much focused on day-to-day people activities. What I see is really happening in enterprise software is this movement toward making artificial intelligence more broadly available. And separate from the kind of issues with what sort of open platforms you have, there's a huge shortage of the people who are necessary for this, because to develop a really good AI program, you need to have not only people with business knowledge, people with software knowledge, but also people with both sorts of knowledge, the data scientists. And you need a lot of people who are specialized data engineers who really understand what kind of data preparation has to be done in order to keep the system running fast, in order to avoid bias in the training data that you set up. But that's a huge area that's starting to explode. So I think um, it goes by various names. I have seen data science platforms as a name used in market research. I'm also seeing ML ops. I'm seeing auto ML and a whole variety of things. This came out of the DevOps phenomenon, which was a new way of developing software that was more efficient and more localized. Um, and that in turn came from agile innovation. So there's a long history, but that's really a big new trend in enterprise software development. Right now, the US is ahead, with the possibility that there may be just as advanced companies in AI, especially in the UK and in France. I think the AI competition between the US and China is intensifying, but I haven't seen that much auto ML, that much on the kind of how to make the development process more efficient in China yet.
It looks like we have room for maybe one more question. And then, of course, I
Okay.
assume that you'll hang out for the
Yeah,
additional questions.
so this will be the last question for the formal class.
Correct. Okay. So, if Southeast Asia digitalization growth is driven by consumers, is it reasonable to say that digitalization is more about inclusion, but yet could potentially be leaving a lot of people behind?
Yeah, there is that possibility. I think what you see, though, is patterns of innovation that very much match local needs. I met the president of Line Corporation's Thailand subsidiary last year, and I was very impressed. You know, of a country with like 60 million population, something like 40 million people use Line. But he pointed out that so many of the people who use Line are basically getting their day's earnings every day in cash. And so they set up this, you know, network of kiosks all over Thailand for people to put in cash and get, you know, credits on their Line account. Um, it would be impossible to have a regular kind of subscription account like you would with an American cell phone provider. So that's a good example of how the wise business people are going to try to open things up and try to include people, really not to increase the gap between the have and the have nots. But of course, there's that danger. One of the interesting things about East Asia people don't talk about much is literacy level. That's very different from India, where it's a much lower literacy rate across the population, because literacy is one huge thing to get over if you're trying to digitalize. This is, I think there's always a danger that this is going to happen. The people who can have a good influence, who can open things up, who can democratize businesses, are probably going to do very well, and they will be doing a good thing. Um, yeah, why don't I call an end to the formal session at this point? I want to thank everybody for your participation. Look forward to seeing you next week, I hope. And we'll keep talking in a more informal pattern from now. But for now, Kimberly, why don't you can turn off the recording?